Welcome back to Computer Science 110. We are still currently going over the cyber ops block, and today we're going to be going over personal network defense and security. It's a pretty easy lesson, pretty short, with only a couple key terms, so let's just get right into it. So today for objectives, there's a lot of objectives. I just realized each one is just basically one word you got to understand. So we're going to talk about asymmetry of defense, no perfect security, defense in depth. We're going to go over some basic network defense tools such as firewalls and servers and IDS and IPS. And finally, we're going to talk about some firewall whitelisting and blacklisting and talk about the difference between those two. We're also going to do some proxy servers. We're going to talk about caches and filtering of proxies. And finally, we're going to talk about signature-based, statistical anomaly-based intrusion detection. Really easy stuff. Don't get beat up by the words. And then we're actually going to go over some personal security practices you can do to actually protect yourself. So with that being said, you ready?
Absolutely. Let's do this.
Let's do it. All right. Overarching concepts. Asymmetry of defense. So this is an interesting one for me and Captain K, because Captain K is an OCO operator. Yep. He's offensive, and I'm a defensive operator. So DCO as they call it. And this is the reason that the DCO side of the house sometimes is horrible. So an attacker only needs to find one single weak point. Your job, we can't get into the classifications of things, but when you were doing an attack, you were doing a certain attack. You were doing one attack, maybe you had a plan for a couple little items. Whereas in my job was to defend the entire Air Force network against every attack known to man. And that's what we call the asymmetry of defense. It means we have to defend everything while an attacker just has to be good or find one vulnerability and get in. Behind us, as you can see right there, is in very small print. If you pull up the slides, you can see this. It's called the MITRE ATT&CK framework. And this is just a basic outline of all the different styles of attacks. And it kind of shows you how many there are. And my coworker here, Captain K, really loves the MITRE ATT&CK framework, so we put it up there for him. But just think about this. If you're an attacker, you could pick 3 or 4 of those things and get very good at those. So you can become a specialist at those types of attacks. And you can just look for networks that have that one particular vulnerability in it. But if you're a defender, I can't become specialized at defending against one attack. I have to defend against everything all the time. And that's the big overarching concept of asymmetry of defense.
Nothing on this attack matrix is anything super new or novel. This is stuff that attackers use all the time. This is just a way to think about it and place different things in a way that we can say a common language. So with networking, you can talk about networking protocols. This is a common protocol of how we can talk about different attacks and the way that they can go after certain pieces of the network.
It really shows off the landscape, too, of how many attacks are out there at all times. Do you want to take care of this one?
Absolutely. So this is what we talked about with the CIA triad, and we're going to talk about it in a little bit more detail here. But essentially, there is no perfect security. We cannot 100% guarantee that software is ever going to be free of bugs. We can prove that with math proofs. We can talk about that. But ultimately, we cannot 100% guarantee that any system is going to be 100% safe from every single possible attack. So if, let's say, you air-gap the network, that eliminates some threats, but other threats, like an insider threat, is still going to exist. And with every single choice that we make, we have to balance security and accessibility. So the more secure it is, the less accessible it is. And let's say that we had a system where we needed to know where our troops were deployed, and we needed to access that on a daily basis. If we made the system so secure that it took 48 hours to access this system, we wouldn't be able to get information in time for it to actually be usable to us. So whenever we talk about the rest of these trade-offs, we have to think about what is our security level or our security posture, and what is that going to cost us in terms of accessibility.
Absolutely. Defense in depth, I'm going to take this one mostly because we use the word way too often in the DCO world. But so think back to that MITRE ATT&CK framework. Think about all those different attacks, and there's different ways to defend against it. The basis of defense in depth, and I'm not going to read the slides to you, is simple. No one thing will ever protect us from everything. So what we're going to have to do is layer on the defenses. I need multiple things. I need devices, I need software, I need training. As you can see on there, user training is a huge part of defense in depth. I need all of these things to protect my data or my actual systems themselves, depending on what you're protecting, because none of this is going to prevent every single attack. And this is, if you ever get over to the DCO world, this is something you gotta get used to. We have lots and lots of tools, lots and lots of pieces of software and hardware, and we have lots and lots of training for not only defenders, but also for the users on the network.
And think about this from what we talked about earlier with the asymmetry of defense. If, say, an attacker found one loophole or opening in that firewall, but they didn't know about the spam filter, all of a sudden they have to work that much harder to get past the second thing in the chain. And so each additional thing adds on time or preparation or planning or cost to the attacker. So as you add more of these things, it becomes more costly for somebody to attack. And a lot of what we think about with security is making ourselves less attractive targets. So if we can make our attack surface or available options less, and if we can make our network more costly to infiltrate or exfiltrate data, all of a sudden it becomes less likely that attackers are going to come after us.
Absolutely. All right, let's get into some of the devices. So first and foremost, we're going to talk about the most basic device, and this is called a firewall. The biggest thing about a firewall is you got to understand it's a pretty simple device for the sake of this lesson. There is more advanced firewalls now, and they call them next generation firewalls, things of that nature. But a firewall basically just looks at traffic coming into your network or leaving your network and just basically squashes it if it doesn't meet a certain rule. Now, old school firewalls, or the firewalls that we're talking about, usually it's just looking at IP address, maybe port, things of that nature. Very simple. It doesn't know what the information is. It just knows I'm not supposed to let port 443 go through here or port 80, and it just squashes it. And it squashes it using a list. And we have two different types of lists for the sake of this lesson. We call it blacklisting and whitelisting. Blacklisting tells the firewall, do not let this stuff in. Whitelisting says only let these things in. And we use both in different situations depending on how strict you want to be. Because think about a blacklist. I can't describe every bad that exists in the world. I don't know all the bad, 0 days and things of that nature. But a whitelist, I can at least say only let in these 5 things, only let in the good. And of course, that's not a perfect world either, but we use both whitelists and blacklists on firewalls depending on the system. But
Absolutely.
Very basic device. Just remember, it looks at packets. It's very, I guess, almost unintelligent, and it just makes a quick decision. I'm allowed to let that in, or I'm not allowed to let that in. That is it. With that, do you want to go over proxies?
Absolutely. So a proxy is a kind of an in-between computer between your system and a system out on the internet. Or it could even be within the internal network. All of this does is it makes requests on your behalf. So rather than your computer directly reaching out and say making a DNS request, you might go through a proxy DNS where the DNS proxy goes and makes that request for you. So this can be really good when we want to, say, monitor traffic on our networks, when we want to see what sites people are going to, but it also has some negative consequences in larger terms of security, because the proxy has to be able to understand and read that traffic. So in some ways, that proxy enables us to do some things faster, especially when it talks about caches or it talks about some of the inspection that it can do. But it is also sometimes a detriment to security because it ruins some of the end-to-end encryption that can exist for some services. So that proxy can be both a good thing and a bad thing at the same time.
Yep. And at the very bottom, you'll see a real-world application. You see proxies used most often as web proxies. And the Air Force uses a web proxy. That's what's stopping you from going to websites that aren't allowed. It also does some other cool little tricks, like it protects us from the real world knowing every IP address of every computer in the Air Force. They just see a proxies reaching out to them. They don't see that my computer or whose computer is reaching out to them. So you're going to see that a lot. IDSs. So we're going to go over IDS and IPS. And the biggest one, you'll see it just in red underlined right there. The big difference between an IDS, which is a detection system, and an IPS, which is a prevention, is an IDS is just watching. That's all it's doing. All it's going to do is look at traffic, and if it sees something that it thinks is bad, or we've taught it was bad, or it's listed down as bad, it's just going to notify us. It doesn't stop the bad traffic. It just notifies a user, usually someone that's working in a secure, like a SOC, or it could be anyone actually, but it just notifies, hey, I saw some bad stuff. You might want to check it out. In the bottom, you're going to see some basic terms that we talked about on the objectives. Signature detection, statistical detection. And this is a lot like signature and behavioral. Signature means it's looking for something very exact. It knows this type of attack. It knows this is a bad IP address. It knows this is a malformed packet. It must know exactly what it's looking for, and then it'll report on that. The majority of your IDSs are going to be based on signature detection. Now, statistical detection is kind of like that unicorn. It does work, but it's not perfect, but it's looking for patterns, things that could be bad. So a good example is that we talked about denial of services. So it doesn't have to know exactly where it's coming from. It might just see there's a lot of packets coming from a certain machine going to a certain machine, and it might make the decision that this could be a pattern that it wants to report on. But the biggest takeaway from this slide is IDSs, or intrusion detection systems, simply watch and report. They don't do anything. So to make this quick, then you'll see an IPS. Notice its position's a little different in the network because it can do one extra cool trick. It can stop the traffic. Sometimes this is good, sometimes this is bad. If you have a false positive, it'll just kill it in its tracks and I don't get what I need. And realize it works off the same types of signature detection or statistic detection. So IPS is a prevention system. It can physically stop it. IDS is just a simple, hey, I saw something bad, you might want to look at this. Which if you think about it, if you don't have 24/7 monitoring, could go bad really fast. All right. You want to go over some personal security recommendations?
Absolutely.
Go for it.
So first, the biggest one is whenever you make a password, make sure that it's strong. So one of the biggest items that I can say about passwords is you want to make it as long as the website or as the service will let you make it. So make it as long as you can, because that is the single best way to prevent users from being able to crack it without knowing your password. The other big thing is don't reuse passwords. If you reuse passwords, essentially somebody could break into a system and find your password in one location, and then they could use that all across the network.
These big hacks that you see, like the Twitter accounts are getting hacked and things of that nature, usually the reuse of passwords is the number one problem. They get access to some account that you don't even care about, you know, some dumb website or whatever. But once they have your email and your password, they're going to try to see if they're going to use that password to see if they can log in your email. And then they see you have a bank account, and they use that same password to log in your bank account. And it's funny, but right now there's roughly 600 cadets are going to watch this video, and 300 of you right now are going, oh, I shouldn't reuse my password for my bank account and my Gmail account. No, you shouldn't. We can get a little more paranoid. Don't let people log into your personal network. If you own your own personal network when you're in a house, something like that, that's pretty good security. Lock that bad boy down. There's guest networks, or you can tell them just to live their life without the internet for a few hours. They'll be okay.
Don't trust links. If a link is in a website, in an email that you see, at the very worst case, if you have to go see it, go and type in the address manually. And if you can't get there or can't get to that address, there's no need to actually click on that link, because a lot of those links can look right, and phishing emails or spear phishing emails can look right, and until you go and actually type them in and find out they're not a real thing.
Yeah, if you don't recognize the email, just delete it. If it's important, they'll email you again.
Yeah,
I promise you that.
We like to kind of make fun of systems and how they're sort of easy to break into, and we kind of make fun of defense. But system patches and computer companies work really hard at security. And it goes to show you that how hard defense is. The fact that some people still make fun of system patches and upgrades. But if you can keep your system up to date, that is one of the best ways to prevent your system from getting compromised. Far more than having the best possible password or the most secure network. If you don't update your systems, people will find bugs in those older systems. They will be able to exploit those older devices, and they will be able to use them and get your information much more easily.
There's a few more tips over here. We're not going to go over hardcore. Just don't install software unless you need it, and make sure you trust where you're getting the software from. My favorite is the security CBT we had to take in the Air Force, and they're like, hey, bro, you want to see my mixtape? It's like, no, I don't want to see your mixtape. I don't want to download this program either. Back in the 90s, the internet, I mean, it's still that way now, but at least people are getting smarter. Back in the 90s, like, everything was just malware. Everything, like, oh, you want this new game? You should install it. This Excel sheet, you can play a game on it. They're all worms and all that good stuff. Using a VPN, if you want to, realize public networks, as we talked about in the last lesson of wireless, public networks are not safe. I personally say just don't go on a public network with anything that you don't want to lose. Yep. So if you have a computer that has all your passwords saved in a password manager, don't log in at Starbucks. Don't give me the opportunity to get into your system. Big one that no one thinks about these days is backing up your information. It's all, it's on the computer, it'll be fine. WannaCry was a huge example of that. It was personal computers were being encrypted completely, and in my heart I was like, yeah, so what? But a lot of people are like, well, all my pictures are on there from my child and all this, and I'm like, why aren't you backing this up to the cloud or to a thumb drive? Storage is so cheap that if your pictures are important, put them on a thumb drive and then just put them in a safe somewhere. Yep. Like, store that physical media somewhere. We already talked about attachments and emails, and last but not least, keep your systems up to date. I know Windows pops up and tells you, like, do you want to update? And you said, nah. A lot of those updates are driven by 0 days have been discovered, and Microsoft has done a lot of work to prevent that from happening. And every time you ignore it, you're just keeping your system that much more vulnerable. And the internet is widespread with systems that are just super old web servers. Apache is a great example. A lot of old Apache servers out there that they just don't patch them. And right now, if I legally could, you could just go on the internet and we could probably find about 50 vulnerable servers in maybe 10 minutes? Give or take. It's not hard. Google hacking is a very good skill to have.
There's a website called Showdown.io. Amazing website. Yeah. If you ever want to see anything that's on the internet, like go there.
Yeah. But that's really it. We're going to go over now the summary. So just realize this looks like a lot of objectives, but basically they were just key terms. So we talked about asymmetry of defense. It just means a defender's job is much, much harder than an attacker's job. And it's the same in the real world as well. If you think about a base or something like that, security forces have to defend the entire base, and an attacker only cares about one gate or one door. No perfect security, meaning, I mean, there is, but if
you give up a lot if you have perfect security.
100% secure means it doesn't exist. And then defense and death, we talked about that. It kind of goes back to asymmetry and defense. Not only do I have to defend against one attack, I have to defend against multiple attacks using multiple types of defense postures.
And lastly, we talked about firewalls, proxies, some of the hardware solutions that allow us to implement some of these items. And remember that as you are implementing personal security, all of this requires you to kind of keep up to date. Just like the patches, if you let your personal security go for a while, that leaves you more vulnerable. So the best security is an active security. So continually be aware of what you're using, when you're using, clean up after yourself, and you will be far more protected and your data will be far more secure than if you let that lapse for a long period of time.
No. I think that's it.
That's all we have.
Best lesson ever. Thank you so much. Everyone have a good day.